Cuba is facing its most uncertain moment in decades, not because of a sudden invasion and not because of a single announcement, but because one long-standing lifeline may be quietly disappearing. With Venezuela's leadership removed from power and oil shipments now under direct pressure, the balance that kept Havana afloat is shifting fast. And when President Donald Trump publicly warned Cuba to make a deal before it's too late, he didn't explain what that deal was, or what happens if it never comes. What makes this moment different isn't just the rhetoric, it's the timing, the energy supply, and a global environment that looks far less forgiving than it once did. The warning itself was brief, public, and intentionally open-ended. President Trump posted that Cuba had long depended on Venezuelan oil and financial support, and that arrangement, according to him, was over. He added that there would be no more oil or money going to Cuba, and suggested Havana should act quickly, without specifying how. That ambiguity is important, because in international politics, vague warnings are often more powerful than detailed ones. They force governments to guess which line they may already be crossing, and which consequences might follow. But to understand why this message landed so heavily in Havana, you have to look beyond the post itself, and toward what just happened in Venezuela. Why Venezuela matters. More than ever, for years, Venezuela functioned as Cuba's external shock absorber.
And
Through a political alliance rooted in ideology and mutual survival, Caracas supplied Havana with subsidized oil, fuel that powered electricity generation, transportation, and basic state services. In return, Cuba reportedly provided security assistance, intelligence cooperation, and technical support. This was not charity. It was an exchange. And when Nicolás Maduro was removed from power in a U.S.-led operation, that exchange was suddenly thrown into question. According to publicly available information, U.S. forces began seizing Venezuela-linked oil tankers and exerting pressure over the production and distribution of oil exports. That pressure didn't just affect Venezuela's revenues, it directly threatened Cuba's energy supply. For Havana, this wasn't theoretical, it was immediate. Cuba entered this moment already weakened. Long before Venezuela's leadership crisis, the island was struggling with rolling blackouts, fuel shortages, and declining industrial output. Tourism, once a primary source of hard currency, had not returned to pre-pandemic levels. Long lines at gas stations and supermarkets had become routine rather than exceptional. When an economy operates without reserves, without easy access to credit markets, and without a diversified energy supply, even small disruptions can create cascading effects. And Venezuela was not a small part of the equation. By late 2025, estimates suggested Cuba was receiving roughly 35,000 barrels of oil per day from Venezuela. That volume represented a significant portion of the fuel needed to keep power plants running and transportation systems functional. The loss, or even uncertainty, surrounding that supply was enough to push the system into stress. Cuba's response was swift but measured. President Miguel Díaz-Canel rejected Trump's claims, accusing Washington of turning everything into a business, even human lives, as he put it. He framed the pressure as an attack on Cuban sovereignty and pointed to U.S. sanctions as the primary cause of the country's economic pain. At the same time, the Cuban government acknowledged that dozens of its military and intelligence personnel had been present in Caracas during the operation that captured Maduro, a revelation that underscored just how intertwined the two governments had become. This wasn't just about oil anymore. It was about exposure. Because when alliances are built on mutual dependence rather than resilience, the fall of one partner doesn't just weaken the other. It pulls them into the fallout. While external pressure dominates headlines, many analysts argue that Cuba's crisis runs deeper than sanctions or lost allies. Publicly available economic data shows that Cuba's economy is significantly smaller than it was just a few years ago. Electricity generation has dropped sharply. Tourism remains depressed. And basic state capacity, from healthcare staffing to infrastructure maintenance, has eroded at a pace that's difficult to reverse quickly. These are not signs of a temporary downturn. They are indicators of structural strain. When citizens cannot plan around reliable power, transport, or supply chains, economic activity becomes fragile. Informal markets expand. Skilled workers leave, and institutional credibility quietly weakens. This matters because external shocks don't create collapses on their own. They expose systems that have already lost flexibility. It's worth noting what President Trump did not say. He dismissed the idea of immediate military action against Cuba. He did not announce new sanctions in that moment. He didn't outline a timetable. Instead, he spoke in terms of inevitability, suggesting that Cuba's economy would go down and that the country was going down for the count. This framing shifts responsibility without issuing a direct threat. It implies that events are unfolding naturally and that intervention is optional, not required. In strategic communication, that's a powerful move. It signals confidence while leaving room to escalate later if desired. The question no one answers publicly. At the center of all this is a question no official statement fully addresses. If Venezuelan oil disappears, and if the United States tightens its grip on regional energy flows, who, if anyone, steps in to replace that support? Mexico has already indicated it will not increase shipments. Russia's capacity and priorities are constrained, and that leaves one potential partner everyone watches closely: China. But Beijing's approach to Cuba has always been cautious and transactional. And that raises a critical uncertainty. Will China absorb the cost of stabilizing Cuba, or insist that Havana reform before help expands? That answer may determine whether Cuba experiences prolonged hardship or something far more transformative. And that's where this story turns next. China's relationship with Cuba is often described in ideological terms: two socialist governments linked by history and rhetoric. But in practice, Beijing's foreign policy operates far more on balance sheets than slogans. China has provided Cuba with loans, infrastructure projects, and occasional debt relief. It has invested in renewable energy, agriculture, and telecommunications. Chinese tourists have returned in modest but growing numbers. What China has not done is replace Venezuela as a full-spectrum patron. That distinction matters. According to analysts familiar with Beijing's regional strategy, China prefers partnerships where returns, economic or strategic, are visible and measurable. Cuba, by contrast, offers limited immediate payoff and carries high political risk, especially as U.S. scrutiny intensifies. In other words, Cuba is a partner, but not a priority. Public statements from Chinese officials emphasize cooperation and mutual respect, but they also avoid committing to specific rescue measures. Any additional support, Beijing insists, would require joint decisions and clear terms. That language signals caution. China has watched Cuba struggle with implementation for decades, announcing reforms, partially rolling them out, then reversing course. From Beijing's perspective, pouring resources into a system that resists structural change is not strategic investment, it's exposure. As one former U.S. intelligence official put it, solidarity doesn't keep the lights on. Fuel does. And fuel costs money. China may be willing to help, but only if Cuba can pay, reform, or offer something tangible in return. And that puts Havana in a difficult position. Cuba's leadership has long relied on a familiar pattern. When domestic pressure mounts, look outward. First it was the Soviet Union, then Venezuela. More recently, limited support from Russia, China, and regional partners helped bridge gaps, but never solved the underlying issues. Each time, external relief postponed reckoning rather than enabling transformation. Today's global environment is less forgiving. Energy markets are tighter. Strategic competition is sharper, and patience for indefinite subsidies has worn thin. This means that even if China expands engagement, it is unlikely to do so unconditionally. Assistance would likely come with expectations, economic discipline, transparency, and reform, conditions that collide with how Cuba's system currently operates. A country running out of time, not just fuel. The numbers tell a sobering story. Cuba's economy is estimated to be roughly 15% smaller than it was in 2018. Electricity generation has declined sharply compared to pre-pandemic levels. Tourism remains far below its former strength. Even social indicators once presented as proof of resilience are moving in the wrong direction. Infant mortality rates have risen. The medical workforce has shrunk rapidly as doctors and professionals leave the country in search of stability elsewhere. These are not abstract statistics. They reflect a breakdown in planning, predictability, and trust. When people cannot reliably access power, transportation, or essential services, the economy becomes brittle. And when institutions cannot correct errors openly, mistakes compound. This is what makes the current moment so dangerous. Not dramatic, but fragile. From Washington's perspective, the logic appears straightforward. Without Venezuelan oil, Cuba faces deeper shortages. Without relief, pressure builds. And under pressure, change becomes more likely. But history suggests pressure alone rarely produces controlled outcomes. U.S. officials have signaled that any future engagement would depend on concrete steps by Havana, expanding legal economic activity, reducing restrictions on enterprise, and allowing greater civic space. At the same time, indiscriminate pressure risks reinforcing the very dynamics it aims to weaken, tightening control internally while pushing Cuba to cling to whichever external partners remain. This is the strategic dilemma. Too little pressure sustains stagnation. Too much pressure can harden it. Beyond geopolitics, many analysts argue the root problem lies at home. Cuba's economic system continues to treat private initiative as something to be managed, not encouraged. Small businesses are allowed, then restricted. Rules change without warning. Long-term planning becomes risky. The lesson for entrepreneurs is simple. Don't grow too fast, don't invest too deeply, and always prepare an exit. That environment doesn't produce resilience. It produces caution, informality, and eventual flight of talent. Politically, centralized power and limited accountability reduce feedback. Errors persist longer. Success is harder to reward. And trust erodes quietly, even among those who avoid politics altogether. This internal rigidity magnifies every external shock. One of Cuba's most underutilized assets lies outside its borders. The Cuban diaspora represents capital, expertise, and access to global markets. Many are willing to invest, partner, and rebuild if legal protections and political trust exist. But participation has often been framed as a concession rather than a strategy. Restrictions, suspicion, and bureaucratic barriers have limited the scale of engagement. Countries emerging from long stagnation often rely on their diasporas as bridges to recovery. Cuba has the opportunity, but not the framework, to do the same. Without that bridge, recovery becomes slower and more fragile. All of this leads to a narrowing set of options. If Venezuelan oil flows remain disrupted, Cuba must either secure alternative supply, radically reduce consumption, or reconfigure its economy faster than it ever has before. External partners may help at the margins. Sanctions may tighten or loosen. Rhetoric may escalate or cool. But none of those forces will substitute for internal redesign. And that raises the central question that defines this entire story. Is this the moment Cuba finally changes its model? Or the moment it doubles down and hopes to outlast the pressure? The answer doesn't lie in Washington, Beijing, or Caracas. It lies in Havana. 3 paths forward, and none are easy. When systems reach moments like this, the range of outcomes narrows. For Cuba, analysts broadly see 3 possible trajectories, each with costs, risks, and trade-offs. The first is managed decline. In this scenario, the state absorbs continued shortages. Rationing becomes more normalized, and external assistance, from China or others, arrives only in limited, transactional forms. The government retains control, but living standards stagnate or worsen. The system survives, but at a growing social and economic price. The second path is reactive adjustment without structural reform. Here, Havana introduces selective fixes, temporary market openings, controlled partnerships, or emergency measures aimed at stabilizing energy and food supplies without changing how power and accountability function. This can buy time, but history suggests it does not restore momentum. The third path is the most difficult and potentially the most transformative. Systemic reform driven from within. That would mean redesigning rules so that work, investment, and initiative are rewarded predictably, building institutions that correct mistakes instead of concealing them, and allowing civic participation that produces feedback rather than fear. This path carries risk, but it is also the only one that creates resilience. Despite strong rhetoric from Washington, no external actor can determine Cuba's future on its behalf. Pressure can accelerate timelines. Sanctions can raise costs. Allies can withdraw or hesitate. But none of these forces can manufacture legitimacy, trust, or productivity. In fact, when pressure substitutes for internal reform, it often strengthens the most rigid parts of a system, reinforcing control while weakening adaptability. That dynamic has played out repeatedly in global politics across ideologies and regions. This is why even some critics of Havana argue that the most consequential decisions ahead are domestic ones, not diplomatic. One danger now facing both Havana and Washington is misinterpretation. From Havana's perspective, the risk is assuming that this storm can be waited out, that another external partner will eventually absorb the costs, as happened before. The global environment today makes that far less likely. From Washington's perspective, the risk is assuming that economic pressure will naturally translate into constructive change. Without pathways for reform, pressure can entrench rather than loosen systems. Both sides may believe time is on their side, but time in fragile systems rarely behaves predictably. The events in Venezuela were dramatic, but their meaning extends beyond that country. They demonstrated how quickly external support structures can collapse, how alliances built on exchange rather than reform can unravel, and how states that postpone adaptation eventually confront it under worse conditions. For Cuba, Venezuela was not just a partner, it was a buffer. That buffer is now thinner than it has been in decades. What replaces it, resilience or dependence, will define the next chapter. Cuba's future will not be decided by a single warning, a single sanction, or a single foreign partner. It will be shaped by whether the country chooses to redesign how power, accountability, and economic opportunity actually function, or whether it continues to manage decline through endurance alone. External shocks may accelerate change. They cannot substitute for it. In the next video, We'll look closely at what meaningful reform in Cuba would actually require, why past attempts failed, and whether the current moment makes real change more likely or simply more urgent. Because the most important question now isn't whether Cuba is under pressure, it's whether this pressure finally leads somewhere new.